Hello, everybody. As you're all coming in, welcome to Writer's Lunch. It's good to see y'all back this week. So this week we have Daphne here to talk to us about why word choice matters in your writing. I think this will be a really fun discussion about choosing the appropriate words to say what you want to say in your book. And, Daphne, of course, is fantastic. Y'all have probably all seen her talk before.
We're going to talk about all the wrong words as well, just all the worst words you could possibly choose.
All right. But for now, Daphne, if you would like to go ahead and start, I think we're ready.
Yeah. So today we're talking about word choice, which is getting into the really, really nitty-gritty of writing. Obviously, books are composed of words. And so at some point along the way, you have to choose words that you're going to put into them. So we're going to talk about how to choose the right words and the effect that the words you choose have on your book. And then we're going to have some fun exercises. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat, raise your hand. We're going to be going through this all together. So first of all, what are words? That's always, a really nice building block to start with. Words are how we compose of our language. And so words have different properties. You can have simple words, complex words, general and specific, common and informal, and then familiar and exotic, to name a few of the things. So for example, a simple word would be to walk. A more complex version of that word would be saunter. A general word would be a man. A more specific word would be a bartender. If you're saying something in a really common versus formal, did not quite proofread that correctly, but in a common way, you would say, it's kind of like that. In a more formal way, you would say, it's like that in a way. Familiar and exotic, at least for me, being a white woman from the suburbs of Missouri, familiar word would be a bakery. A more exotic word would be a panaderia, which is something I encountered when I first moved to Texas.
Now, for sure, familiar versus exotic can change with context very much. And English is one of those languages that eats other languages. So it's interesting to go back and look what would be an exotic word 40, 50 years ago in a novel.
Yep. Sushi, for example, sushi would be considered extremely normal now, but is very exotic in the 40s or 50s. So Sean, since you brought up familiar versus exotic, and we will talk a little bit about foreign words later in the presentation, but it brings up an interesting point, which is, do you italicize foreign words? And that is a discussion that has been coming up more and more recently as people who are multilingual enter the writing space where they were normally pushed out. And so these words that we say, you have to italicize it, that's a different language. Well, to a bilingual person, that might not really, it's part of their normal repertoire, right? So they don't have to consider it like it's not an other word. To them, it's a normal word. And so whether or not you italicize words in your writing because they are foreign words is a matter of personal preference, but also a matter of voice. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. To complicate words even more, there's two parts of a word: the denotation, which is its literal definition, and the connotation, which is the many meanings, associations, and implications of the word. So a denotation, a rose is a red flower that grows on a bush. It is often, and that's the denotation. That is what a rose is red flower. The connotation is all the things we associate with it. So red roses are typically associated with love and romance because they're often given to romantic partners. And those associations can vary from person to person depending on your experience. So for me, growing up, very religious household, crosses had a strictly religious meaning. For someone growing up in an atheist or goth household, they could be purely aesthetic. And you might have two very different associations for that object, for that word, for that concept, depending on your experience. So when we talk about connotation in writing, you need to consider your audience's perspective and your character's perspective. And both of those are things we're going to talk about a little more.
If I may, just
Yes.
on the connotation, denotation, because I love this idea and how you're breaking it down in terms of sentence structure, but to pull it to story structure, I love the idea that a denotation, you can assume that your reader will know that. Your connotation, context, culture definitely plays into it, but also you have the chance to build connotation. So if you want a specific connotation for a rose, then you sometimes have to do sentences around that, or a foreshadowing to bring that into the story so that your audience gets the connotation you want out of an object.
Yeah, and I think that we can take that example with the rose and work it really well. So normally roses are associated with romantic feelings, but roses have thorns, which brings in blood. They're red, like the color of blood. And so a rose in a horror story might give a very different feeling than a rose in a romantic story. And you as the author can play with that connotation, pull out different pieces of the sorts of relationships with words that you want to have. So you have your thesaurus and you're like, oh, I'm looking for a more interesting word than smell. Now, all of these words mean the same thing. They all mean a smell, something that you detect with your nose, but they all have different connotations. So if you are talking about something that smells bad, you would go with something like stench or stink or odor. If you're talking about something that smells pleasant, specifically surrounding food, you would look for aroma. If you're looking for a scent that seems, kind of flowery, perfume would usually work. And so how you choose what word you're picking here, you can't just pick up your thesaurus and choose another word because of the connotations. Yeah, Anna?
Yeah, so I'm sure you're probably going to talk about this, but I just wanted to bring this up because you were talking about thesauruses, using a thesaurus to choose another word. One of my pet peeves, and none of these words apply to this pet peeve because all of these are commonly used words that are synonyms or almost synonyms of smell. But one of my pet peeves when I'm reading is when an author uses a word that is extremely obscure, uncommon, or archaic that has a perfectly useful modern synonym that is in use in like modern language. And like when that happens, it feels like the author's just like flipping through a thesaurus looking for a more complicated word or like trying to flex a vocabulary word that is so uncommon that no one's going to know what it means. Anyway, that's a pet peeve that I have.
We're going to talk about genre in a minute, and it's really important because in a literary genre, that happens all the time. They do it very intentionally. It drives me bonkers because I like to read very accessible fiction. And so, but there is also fun ways to deal with that, right? So my husband and I use a word that is kind of uncommon, but that's ablutions, which is I'm going to go do my ablutions, which means I'm going to go get ready for bed or I'm going to go get ready for the day. And so we use this very archaic word, kind of just fun in real life. But for me, that becomes a very common word. And so I have to tell myself in my writing, no, normal people don't use this word.
Don't? I think ablutions is common enough that like if you read a lot of fiction, you see it. Right?
Oh,
you
no.
may not use it in your daily life, but you see it in fiction. But there are words that I've seen in like in reading short stories and stuff. That are like
Sean's writing, perhaps.
What?
Some of Sean's writing, perhaps.
No, not him.
Hey, I gotta say,
like,
ablusions, and I gotta
incredibly like just so incredibly uncommon that like people aren't even using this word. You don't even read this word in books, right? And here it is in this little short story that was submitted to this magazine, and it's like no one knows what this word means, and it doesn't add anything to the story.
Anna working through her trauma.
Here's the connotation denotation where ablutions or ablutions never has crossed my plate ever. And yet you're right, Daphne, that like I'll use some words that are freaking weird for sure. And it goes to, for one, what grade level are you writing for? So your denotation versus connotation, totally, your word choice totally matters in terms of what level of reader that you're aiming for, as well as I love the idea of a word that is obscure, but flows off the mouth well or flows in a sentence well. And so even if the denotation is kind of fuzzy, the connotation or just the word feel of it, like ablution sounds to me, like you are having minor surgery right before bed, that feels like it would come across in this clinical way of doing things. And even if I didn't know, I would read through it, So yeah, two different ways of thinking
It
of
is,
why not?
it is worth noting
why
that
not
you
use
do
weird
not,
words?
you do not necessarily have to sacrifice all of your complex words to be more common for the sake of readability. Because we're writers, I'm going to assume we're all readers. And so if you grew up being a heavy reader, you know very well that you would just encounter new words and you don't know what it means, but you get a vibe for it. You have an idea, and you might not know the exact definition, but you could probably tell people more or less what it is if you grew up reading enough stuff over your head.
Yeah, I just think I have one more thing. One more thing to add. In my opinion, I think that if you're going to use a word that's extremely, extremely obscure, archaic, or just like completely not in use, I think it needs to add something that a more common word doesn't add. And I think a lot of times when people use those kinds of words, they don't actually add anything extra to the sentence, and that's when it becomes a problem.
That's when we're talking about vibes. It's about
but like when they're not adding when it's like, there's a perfectly common word that could have been used here that would have meant exactly the same thing and wouldn't have, and the more complicated word isn't adding an extra connotation or anything at all. So,
and you had raised your hand.
Ablutions is great. It means you not only washed, but you brushed your teeth and you combed your hair and you did everything. And you don't have to list any of them because it's all covered in ablutions.
But it would be a really strange word to include in, well, I'm going to say children's book, first of all, but like it'd be a weird word for me to see even in like just common fantasy books. Jean, you have a really good point. If you are writing dialogue for a character in a period piece, your word choice will be different and possibly obscure. Yes. And we are going to talk about how period plays into how you do your word choice. So why does it matter, right? If we, let's just use the most common words. Well, as we just discussed, your personal vocabulary is different from everybody else's. Literally everybody else's. Where you were born or where you were brought up, what you were exposed to, your level of schooling, your life experiences. Were you in the military? Did you work in an office job? Are you married? Do you have children? That's all going to affect the words that you have access to and the words that come to mind very quickly for you. So if you were to write your book purely in your own voice, it would be very distinctly you. But we're also working with characters. So if you're writing something that's a memoir, your personal voice matters a lot. And your personal word choices are going to play a huge part in that. If you're writing for characters, you have to put yourself in the place of that character and say, what are their experiences? What was their upbringing? What are their exposures in their life that are going to affect their word choice? Because you're going to be using their vocabulary, not yours. That's how you get into the POV of your characters. So if you understand that you have a bias in your language use already, it can help you to set that aside and be a better writer because you're going to be using other people's vocabulary. The first step is awareness. So when you're in like I just mentioned, you're using character voices. As an author, you can use a lot of different tools to characterize your characters. What you present about them is only part of it. So what we see of your character is a small sliver of who they are overall. And you have a limited number of words to give us that exposure to them. So how does your character speak? What dialect do they use? How do you, as the author, describe their appearance and actions? So I have two different examples here. If I could get Anna, you want to read them for me?
Sorry, you caught me right when I was drinking water. All right, so the first one, Peter slunk across the room and sank onto his mattress. I don't know, he growled, wiping his mane of hair out of his eyes. And then the second one, Petey flounced to his bed and flopped down. Like I know, he pouted, sweeping his locks back.
Now, in both of these little paragraphs, the same thing happens. Peter, or Petey, walks across the room, sits on his bed, moves his hair out of his eyes, and says, I don't know. And he does it in two very different ways. The impression you get of Peter versus Petey is very different. And it's all down to word choice. So slunk versus flounced, flopping down on the mattress versus sinking down into it. Even how he says, I don't know, or like I know, gives very different impressions. What a mane of hair is gives like a kind of dirty, matted feel, whereas locks is much more like flowing locks. So, you're going to get a different impression of this character. So just using word choice, we've given two different impressions of this Peter character. And that's the kind of thing that you can use for characterization. We have any questions or comments so far? Nope. Onward and forward. Atmosphere. The atmosphere sets the scene and establishes and reinforces the genre of your story. And genre is very important. We're going to talk about it even more later. But the details that you include in your scene and how you describe them can be very different. So if you want your house to appear spooky, you're going to use different details and use different words to give that spooky feeling. So you might talk about the cobwebs in the corner or the cracked windows. And so you can have this like old abandoned house, and it can be one of two things, or it can be one of many things. Let's do two examples. If you have an old abandoned house, it can be spooky and haunted and scary. It can also be a new family coming in, and it's going to be their renovation project, and they're very excited, and all they see is opportunities. And you can use your word choice to just portray those two different things. Once again, we have some examples. Does anyone want to read them for us? If not, I will just do it. Okay.
Oh, I'm here for you. Sorry.
All right, go for it, Sean.
Okay, cool. Mansion house loomed from the top of the hill, dark windows glinting in the full moon. The bare, gnarled limbs of the tree in the front yard creaked and swayed. As opposed to, Goodall House stood sentry at the top of the hill, wide windows sparkling in the moonlight. The cherry tree in the front yard rustled in a gentle breeze.
Great job.
Very well done. So there's a few things I did here very intentionally that are creating this different atmosphere. One, I used the names of the house. In the first one, it's Manson House with a connotation or a relationship to Charles Manson, giving it a spookier feel. Goodall House has good in the name, so it's going to give a different feeling as well. And then not just choosing words based on denotation, but also just for word feel. The word cherry in the second one, the cherry tree in the front yard. Now, I didn't specify what kind of tree it was in the first one. Didn't matter because it was spooky. In the second one, making it a cherry tree, the word cherry is very close to the word cheery. And so it gives this evocative, like, more wholesome, more happy vibe just by the word association, your eyes glancing over it.
That's vibes, baby. That's not where it's got anything to do with the connotation, the denotation. It's how that word feels as your brain rolls over it. I love that.
Mm-hmm. So Cece in the chat asked, is atmosphere the same as mood or a combo of setting and mood? I would consider it is the same as mood. It's because it's kind of separate from your setting. Right. So here we have the same setting and we're describing it in two different ways, and it has two different atmospheres. So I would say that it is the same thing as mood. It's what feeling your character or your reader is getting as they walk into a scene. And that affects what they're anticipating is coming next. And so that brings us to something that's actually much more amorphous, the author's voice. This is something that agents and editors and publishers talk about all the time, reviewers talk about all the time, but it's actually a very difficult concept to pin down. What is your author's voice? And your author's voice has a couple of different components. It's comprised of the way that you structure your words and your sentences and your whole book. But word choice is part of it. It's also sentence structure. Do you use long, complicated sentences? Do you use short, crisp sentences? Your ratio of showing versus telling, the amount of detail and description. Anna and I were talking about J.R.R. Tolkien yesterday, day before, and how he opens up Two Towers with 50 pages of talking about a forest. I can't stand that, and I would never write it that way. But that is something that was part of his author's voice, that amount of detail and description that he used, the amount and the style of your dialogue, all of these things combine together to give you this unique author's voice. Yes, Anne? Oh, you're muted, Anne.
Sorry. One way of being different is to avoid subordinate clauses. That makes a huge difference. You
Sorry,
can
go ahead.
have a lot of subordinate clauses, or a few, or none, or as few as possible. The style is strikingly different if you avoid them.
Yeah, and that's part of sentence structure. I'm not sure that there's necessarily if that's better to avoid subordinate clauses. It is different from a lot of writers.
Right.
It gives you short, choppy sentences.
Not necessarily. There's all kinds of things you can do other than subordinate clauses to make your sentences long.
Each their own, absolutely. And yes, if that's a style that you're looking for and you appreciate that, The only thing I ever say about when people are like deciding on author style or voice like this is read it out loud and compare it to something that you really like. It's not like we're stealing, let's say, from other authors we really love, but there's always the influence out there of authors that you like. So if you can read out loud something that you really like and get to understand how that mouthfeel is, I'm using food words, I know, but like it totally matters. And then compare to how your style of dialogue, how your style of description is working, you can see where the starts and stops and slows and, you know, it's why it's so audio. It's different.
I mentioned this because I was reading, I can't think of his name, he's well known anyway, about translating the Bible. There's many, many translations out there right now, and many of them are more paraphrased than translations. But he points out that people are inserting subordinate clauses where the Bible doesn't. It doesn't, it can, but it usually doesn't.
That can be a function of the language, too. I mean, if you're talking about Aramaic in the first place, then they might not have the same sentence structures that we do have today. So translating into contemporary is different. Sometimes the connotation and the denotation of words, especially in translation, can be vastly different.
So we definitely need to have a future writer's lunch on author's voice. There are a number of things. If you're just writing as yourself, you're going to have an author's voice that will naturally come out in your work. But there's a lot of things you can do to be more intentional about your author's voice and actually refine it and bring it out in a beautiful way. But that is a whole other writer's lunch. We're just talking about word choice, which is only part of it. But
there's a lot of people that are familiar with the King James translation. And I try for that. Sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. So your author's voice is different from your narrative voice. And we started talking about characters, and we're bringing back characters now because it depends on what POV you're going for. Anna did a great presentation on POV a few months ago, talking about deep POV, which is when you're very inside a character's head, shallow POV, where you were kind of in the character's head, but you're a little more set apart from them, and objective narration, which is the narrator or the author is watching all of these things happen and is telling the story outside of the character's perspective at all. So why that has to do with word choice. You as an author have a very different vocabulary from your characters because your characters are not you, and you as the author are embodying the narrator, and you have a different set of words at your disposal. And so if you are writing a character who has very strong accent or regional dialect or something like that, and your narration is not in that dialect, you're going to use two different sets of word choices when you're writing. There's going to be some that are used when your character is talking, which is their dialogue. That's going to be entirely in the character's voice and going to be in the character's word choices. Their direct internal thoughts will also be from their perspective in their word choice. The other things like actions, exposition, emotion, description, etc., that'll be in your narrator's voice. So you can choose to have a narrator who is a character. That would be like Lemony Snicket. You can choose to have a narrator that's just kind of you, the author, are telling the story, in which case you can use your own word choices to describe things. Or if you are doing deep POV, in which case the story is being told by your character, then all of this is in your character's voice and uses your character's word choices. So now that I've talked about what we're doing, right? Why we're choosing our words carefully and what we can accomplish by choosing our words carefully. Let's talk about the actual choosing of the words. How do you go about deciding which word is correct? So first thing to consider is your audience. Who will be reading your book? Age range is what most people talk about first, which is children, young adults, or elderly. With children, you're looking for simple, clear words. For the most part, because they're learning to read and we're trying to make this accessible for them. For young adult, you have to keep up with current slang, which is very difficult. I tried to write a little segment in current slang and I failed. So I'm no longer one of the cool kids. But you do risk it becoming dated because that current slang and current references are going to become dated in a few years. You're also going to be starting to add in more complexity. Young adult is not quite at the same reading level. From a publishing standard, young adult is not at the same reading level as an adult. The reading level that they strive for is lower, but you are getting more complexity than you are with children's books. With adult books, you can start incorporating swearing because young adult typically does not allow you to incorporate swearing, and you add in even more complexity. Elderly has kind of a question mark on it, because there are not many books that are marketed as for elderly audiences. That's typically a choice of what characters are you talking about. But in books that are marketed more toward books that are the main audience is for older people, you can have more older references, older slang, because that's what's going to be accessible to them. And in cases of books that are written for people who might have dementia, they might be using simpler words, simpler sentence structures. I've also included education level on here, and that is separate from age range. So typically we think about like, okay, well, how old is the person? That's their education level. But there is a literacy crisis in the United States. There are a lot of people who struggle at reading at the appropriate age level, who struggle with reading at all. And so there is a specific genre called high-low books, which is high interest, low reading level books. They are adult storylines. They deal with complex characters and adult situations, but they're written at a lower reading level so that they're more accessible to people who might have not had a lot of practice with reading when they were growing up. So if you are ever interested in writing high-low books, I think that's a really great niche. It's a really interesting genre, and it's worth a look. So if you feel like you have good stories that you could simplify for a lower reading level, absolutely check that out. Underutilized genre. How do you determine the reading level of your book? I have gotten Sean with this a couple times.
I was like, there's an app for that, isn't there?
There's a number of websites. What you're looking for is you're looking for reading level of writing. There's some specific websites. I'm sorry, I'll put them in the chat later on. But there are websites where you can put in a sample of your writing or even your entire book to determine the reading level. Chandra Smith says, can we receive a recording of this? Yes, it will be on our Facebook page. So determining the reading level of your book. A lot of adult books are not written at a college level, not even a high school level. A lot of mainstream published books are written at about an 8th grade level. And that's just because it's easier to read. It's for a lot of, especially genre fiction, especially romance, you're looking at people just want to read to have fun. They don't want to necessarily be reading to be stretching their vocabulary or to be trying to parse through complex sentences. So a lot of the time when you are looking at what you're writing, you're going to be wanting to go somewhere around like 8th, 9th grade reading level. If you're looking for that sort of popular appeal. Literary skews higher for obvious reasons, but it is worth looking at what is the typical reading level for what you're trying to write.
Let me throw this out there because it's a business, because you are trying to, as a publisher, get as many people as possible to read your book. The point you made earlier about your age is not your reading level totally applies as an adult for sure. And so if you want more people to read your book, you do need to be a little bit lower on reading level to hit as many people as possible, so that you don't have too many moments in your book when, the reader's staring back at the words and saying, I don't understand this.
I've also put dialect in here. That is somewhat the purview of translators, though. Even with books that are just hopping from England to America, they have specific translators there to actually tweak the language to make it more American versus more British. So it's not necessarily something that you have to worry about, but if you feel like worrying about it, it's there for you.
You should include the Australian as well, because that's a whole new set of words.
You're right.
Do they do Australian translations between the British? I thought they just did the British, but you might be right for sure.
No, there's actually websites to go to that will help you understand what it means to speak in Australian terms. And a lot of it, it's just derived from when they got there and they were mixing the English and the French and other people together, and the language became a real hodgepodge. But it's real interesting. I've had a couple of Australian characters in my books, and they say strange things sometimes, which the Americans tend to adopt and start using, which is kind of like the way it is in life.
We really need to have a writer's lunch on translation. Unfortunately, I don't think any of us are qualified on that. We'll have to find someone.
I could definitely ask. I could ask around.
I've got someone I could ask. We'll talk about it. All right. Next thing to consider. We're starting broad. We're getting more specific. Your genre. What people expect out of the word choices in your genre actually matters a lot. And so what you can get away with in different genres is very different. We've talked already about literary genre allows for more complex vocabulary than popular fiction. That's call it popular fiction. Someone mentioned earlier historical. If you are writing in a historical fiction novel, you need to consider what the word choices at the time were. What were common words, what were common phrases, and also what hasn't been invented yet. Some idioms that we take for granted, like he was ready right out the gate. When did right out the gate become an idiom? It's based on horse racing, but horse racing dates back a while. So when did that become a common phrase? Especially Americans are very used to using idioms in our writing. So you really need to watch out for those when you're looking at historical stuff, because sometimes things are a much more recent invention than you ever thought was possible. We don't talk much about the invention of words, but there were words that weren't invented yet. Speculative fiction, so that's science fiction, fantasy, horror, anything that involves magic or stuff that doesn't really exist.
I hate to interrupt. I'm going to leave. I've got to leave for an appointment, but I want to throw a little bit of Australian out there. There's a phrase called "flat out like a lizard drinking," and that's one that's kind of hard to interpret. But if you ask an Australian, they know what it means. You can look it up. Oh, I'm not going to tell you. You have to look it up.
It's a good answer. Just leave it at that.
Yeah.
Nice to see you, Russ. Heck yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Along those lines of fun idiom or fun word choices in Norway, to say that something is really like wild or off the hook or like that party got really wild, you use the word Texas. So you say, that's so Texas, that's so crazy. Since there's a lot of Texans here, we really have to talk about that. So anyway, speculative fiction. In science fiction, you will be able to use a lot more technical words than you would in other genres. In science fiction and fantasy both, you have a lot bigger tolerance for creating new words just wholesale. We talk about Shakespeare invented a lot of words. Lots of words come out of science fiction and fantasy as well. So you're given a lot more flexibility. You can be like Anna and construct a language all your own. I won't ever do that. That sounds like a lot of work, but you can, and that is acceptable. Sorry, Anna in the chat. That's an acceptable thing to do in speculative fiction, depending on a couple things. If your speculative fiction is pretty far removed from our everyday experiences, and so what I mean is, if you're writing second world fantasy or sci-fi that doesn't involve like everyday occurrences that we're still experiencing, you can have wildly different word choices. Be careful of including words and concepts that don't exist in your world. This is one of my pet peeves in reading, and I haven't come across it in a while, but if you are in a second world that is nothing like ours, right? We're on a spaceship. It's never even heard of Earth. No one's going to say Jesus Christ. No one's going to say, oh my God. The word damn might not even be in there, because those are concepts that are very specific to Christianity or just like Earth religion in general. And so you got to watch out for those, because those are very common phrases that we just kind of like let slip through that might not fit in your world at all. Virus Master 95 to all of us said, how about instead of saying that a character is acting stupid, use the term the wheel is spinning, but the hamster is dead. That is very evocative. So in speculative fiction, be careful of using words that might not exist, concepts that might not exist. For example, and this is the pet peeve, Furies, F-U-R-I-E-S, the Furies come from Greek mythology. They are an actual character of Greek mythology. And so when I see the word fury outside of our own history, it always is a little jarring to me, because I'm like, but they don't have Greek mythology. But if you follow that rabbit hole too far, you're not going to be able to use any words at all. So don't think too hard about it. Thriller, I put in here because there's more tolerance for crime or legal specific jargon. There's often more medical talk than you would have, let's say, in like a romance novel. So it depends on your oh, and romance has its own set of word choices that we're going to leave out of this because they're all euphemistic and it's very funny. But yeah, so you have genre-specific word choices, vocabulary choices that are available to you. Dean mentions in Star Wars, they don't say English, they say basic. Yeah, because our characters, there's no English. There's no England. So what are they going to say? D&D uses common as the base language. And I find that really fascinating. It's a detail.
Let me throw this out there, though, as well, because they use common, but in D&D, you can play the game in any language. So common is a stand-in for, Hindi and Japanese and French as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next, your book's specific setting. Time period. So we talked about historical, that's related to this time period, looking for slang, looking for references, looking for idioms, but also your location. And we're going to talk about regional word choices because location is much more than just Australia or India, Brazil, or the United States. Because even within the United States, you have to make some word decisions that you might not realize. Are there accents? Are there foreign words? We talked about italicizing and what words are considered normal. And I grew up in St. Louis, just outside of St. Louis. I never heard of a quinceañera until I moved to Texas. That was not a word in my vocabulary. And now I am very aware of them. And so now I would not consider italicizing quinceañera because that's not a foreign word for me anymore. Just things. Okay, let's have some fun. Regional differences. Oops. What is your generic term for a sweetened carbonated beverage? The blue on this map represents where people say pop. The red on the map is where people say soda. And the green on the map is where people say Coke. So I grew up in St. Louis, big old red spot right there between Missouri and Illinois. So I grew up saying soda. A lot of people I knew from further north said pop. And then I came down to the south. And sometimes people say, oh, what kind of Coke do you want? Bizarre. All right. Oops. That one. Okay. What do you call the thing from which you might drink water in a school? All of the red says water fountain. The blue says drinking fountain. And up in Wisconsin, for whatever reason, and not Delaware, maybe Delaware.
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island. Thank you. All the little ones over on that side are just flyover states.
Oh my God.
So
sorry, as a Yankee, I'm like, what is wrong?
For some reason, Rhode Island and Wisconsin, they refer to it as a bubbler.
I want to throw one out, which is, a pronunciation one. But I was in Scranton one time as a teenager hanging out, and one of the kids, we were riding bikes in the late 90s, goes, I need to get a drink of Wooda.
Oh, no.
But the accent was so strong, the few of us that were from somewhere else could not understand what this person wanted. So they wanted to drink water, but it was so different that it was like, that's a new word to me.
Oh my God. So, all right. What is your general term for a rubber-soled shoes worn in gym class or athletic activities? The red all says tennis shoes. The blue say sneakers. And somewhere on here is green where they say gym shoes, although it's very faint, so I don't know exactly where it is. I grew up actually choosing between tennis shoes and sneakers, which is partly because my family is all from Miami, so down in this blue section. So my parents said sneakers, so I always thought sneakers was okay, but everyone else growing up around me said tennis shoes, so I swapped between the two. I find it really interesting how your background affects like these little things that you choose. And then my favorite slide by far. What do you call it when the rain falls while the sun is shining? For most of the red United States, I have no term or expression for this. The blue will call it a sun shower, and the very faint green, but it's right here, right between Alabama and Mississippi. The devil is beating his wife, which is
the only reason that's not so green is because, oh, come on, Anna, you were sheltered. I have heard that in Alabama. Oh my!
I have never. I have heard people online saying that people from Alabama say that. I have never heard a single person from Alabama say that phrase. And I grew up in Alabama.
Daphne, I do hope you have as well the one about the road that gets you onto and off of the freeway.
Oh, the feeder roads?
Do you have that?
I did not have that slide, but that's interesting. I didn't know the word feeder road until I moved to Texas.
I didn't either.
It's not even just Texas. It is the word feeder road is very centered on Houston. And it does extend up to Texas, San Antonio and stuff these days, but it's like that bright green oddity in that map is right centered on Houston for calling it a feeder. And then other places
we didn't even have a word for that.
And
we didn't have a word for it at all.
Yeah.
No, it was just the road next to the I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, we didn't have we called it an on-ramp when it was actually going up onto the highway, but like the road itself, we didn't have a term for that.
So I encourage you to look up regional differences, especially if you're writing for somewhere that you don't know very well. I feel at this point I could write a book in St. Louis or a book in Houston, maybe Dallas, I don't know, and write with some authority for the characters' voices. But if I were to set my book in Los Angeles or New York, I'd be lost, absolutely lost. I'd have to look up everything.
Let me throw this out there as well, which I love to use, which is on YouTube, there are a lot of like man on the streets or like interviews with people based on neighborhoods in places all over the place. So you can look up a specific city or a specific neighborhood in a city, and just hearing people talk is terribly interesting. Just telling stories about their day or anything like that. And it's real contextual and very different. I love this about the 21st century. Yeah.
Watching local news stations from wherever you're setting your book is also very helpful, especially the traffic reports, because what people call their highways in the city is not exactly what it is, right? So we talk about 59. Highway 59 is actually Interstate 69, but no one calls it that. So you can't just assume, oh, it's labeled Interstate 69, that people are going to call it that. That's not true. Like you have the 610 loop, but is it a loop there? Is it something else? I don't know. So you have to learn what your local people are calling things.
Okay, I gotta say this, because 610, at least in Houston, is a circle. But there's a road in Austin called Loop 1 that goes north and south.
Mopac. It's actually called Mopac.
Neither the twain shall meet. It is Loop 1. It goes in one direction. That's it.
Yes, but no one calls it Loop 1. They call it Mopac.
Yes.
That's so much worse. Okay, so sorry, still talking about setting. When you're talking about fictional words, or fictional worlds, you have invented concepts and words, constructed languages, and once again, you're looking out for things that don't apply to your world. If I have an underground people, right, they've lived their entire lives in the center of their world, they don't have a concept of the sky, so the sky's the limit, not a phrase they're going to use. I have to think of something else, right? Which character is talking in your novel? So I've got my 6 characters here, and they're all going to have very different ways of speaking, even if they are living currently in the same location. Their age, their background, their life experiences, their personality, those are all going to affect the kinds of things that they say. So if you have someone who's in law enforcement, they might speak very differently from someone who is not. Someone in the military has a whole other set of vocabulary at their disposal. Time check. Gotta move, hustle a little bit. And then finally, what situation your characters are in. People speak differently to their friends than they do to strangers. Teenagers in particular speak very differently to their friends than they do to their parents. People speak differently to their love interests. I talk to my husband differently than I talk to my friends. If I were being arrested, the way I spoke would be very different from my normal way of speaking. Are you in a romantic scene? Are you in an action scene? Is somebody injured? Are we laying our hearts on the table? All of these things are also going to affect your word choice, your character's word choice. If your characters are going into a scene that's very scary, your word choice describing the atmosphere, describing the scene as they go into it should be different than if they're going into a romantic scene. And so finally, we come to the class participation part of this. The whole thing was class participation, but this part really is. I have exercises. I have written 3 of the most bland sentence groupings that you have ever seen in your life, and we are going to attempt to pep them up. So, she crossed the beach to the place where she sold seashells. What words can we replace or add in this to make this a more evocative sentence?
What genre are we in?
I don't know. We can create one. Why don't you pick a genre for us?
No, don't pick on me. No. Let's make this romantic.
Okay. All right. We have romantically, we are doing this. From the chat, say the colorful sand where she sold seashells. I really shot myself in the foot on this one. I thought I was being clever. And I really regret it.
I say, instead of the beach, the warm white sands.
Ooh, there you go. Let's say she skipped. She's excited about her day. She skipped across the warm white sands.
And do we know who she is yet? I mean, we might be describing the girl. This is a new character.
Yeah, I mean, I was very generic. So if you want her to be our main love interest, then we can give her a name and everything.
She skipped eagerly.
Get some adverbs in there.
Yeah,
Shanindra has a pretty good sentence in the chat if you want to read it, Daphne.
I do want to read it.
And then Sean has a bonkers one.
Of course. She waltzed across the warm sand thinking about her shells that she'd be selling. Sean says, Dilly McPherson cartwheeled across the dunes, dodging parasols before settling into the warm wooden bench behind her street cart, adorned with abalone and coral.
Sorry, definitely way too many words and way too big words.
Nope, you're going for a specific aesthetic.
Cartwheeled aesthetic.
Yeah, this is like Pippi Longstocking grown up. Absolutely.
My husband has chimed in from the peanut gallery to say she boobed boobily across the sand.
Why?
That is an internet joke. We will make that point right now. Yes.
With her strawberry blonde hair flowing in the wind, she danced across the sand that was as soft as sugar. Wonderful. We're getting really good. Look at you guys. All right, we do have limited time, so let's go with exercise 2. The spaceship traveled to the planet. The crew talked about the surface of the planet and the people that they would find there. Let's make this horror. Oh no, let's not make it horror because I'm going to have horror in the next one. So let's make this, we'll just do straight sci-fi.
All right, I want these people to have 6 eyes and 3 boobs.
Fascinating.
Exactly. But like the crew talked about the surface of the planet. I feel like that this is actually a trick because this should be an actual conversation. Like this should be a paragraph. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I only had so much to work with.
Yeah.
We could do like, rather than talked, you could do like argued, or to make it more tense, we could do argued.
Yeah, the crew argued on whether or not they had mammalian physical characteristics or if they'd be lizard people. Cece says all I have is Star Trek terms.
The planet loomed large in the spaceship's view screen. That's so much better. That gives an actual like picture of what's going on as opposed to just the action. Replacing the people could be like the nomads or they could say barbarians if they're being pretty awful. All right, from the chat. The starship raced across the planet's surface. The crew was as nervous as they could be, for they did not know what to expect from the natives of the planet. They debated what the surface of the planet would look like. From W.G. Walters, the transport landed on Earth, where they searched for the ore in the system desired. Yes, all good stuff. I hope I'm pronouncing this. Shanandra? On its long travel to Earth, the 6-eyed aliens argued about which humans they would kill or keep as slaves, as well as which landscapes they would decide to save for themselves.
Yes.
How about which ones they would eat?
There you go.
They don't know if we're tasty yet. They haven't gotten here. They'll figure that out later.
Kill, keep, or eat. All right. And then exercise 3. He walked into the empty house. The door shut on its own behind him. He heard noises coming from the floor above. A ghost placed its hand on his shoulder. I would say, starting off by replacing walked with crept. He crept into the empty house. The door heaved shut behind him. You can describe the noises coming from upstairs. You want creaks and moans.
What genre are we going for? I mean, this already looks like horror.
I think horror.
Okay.
From the attic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rather than floor above, an attic. A ghostly hand gripped his shoulder, ragged nails catching on the fabric of his shirt. Much better, Anna.
But ragged nails on his shoulder. He turned, but no one was there.
Yep. Okay. We are just over 2:00, and so I'm gonna. We have a couple, and I'll read those, and then we'll end.
I have spelling in mind. Yeah, he's supposed to be crap.
As he stalked into the empty house, the door slammed with a bang behind him.
Slammed.
He heard a wailing noise like a woman who just lost her baby, mixed with the sound of a werewolf getting a tooth removed. Wow. He crept into the dilapidated mansion and startled when the wind blew the heavy oaken door closed with a bang. He nervously closed the door behind him as he tiptoed into the empty house. He felt a cold chill brush against his shoulder. As he turned around, he felt a heavy hand weigh him down. Johnny Depp took 2 steps into the set of Sweeney Todd 2. A gaffer slammed the door to his stage left. He glanced over at his shoulder at his slim fingers reaching for his lapel, covered in his own blood.
I couldn't figure out how to fit Amber Heard into it, but that's what I was going for.
What word?
Johnny Depp's ex-wife.
Yeah, it's a whole drama. It was like crazy, yeah.
All right. Well, it's just past 2. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I am Daphne Strasert. You can find me everywhere on the internet as Daphne the Writer. and at daphnestrasert.com. I'm also an editor at Tomeworks, and that is tomeworksedits.com. Feel free to reach out to me. It's Daphne at tomeworksedits.com.
Absolutely. I love it. I was food for thought. You had a lot of audience participation and so many different words to consider.
So many words.
So this is like a topic that could go on for so long. I love it.